For 17 long years, Walter Wally Grayson sat on the same street corner of a busy city. Every morning, as the sun rose, he would wake up, stretch his tired legs, and settle into his usual spot near the old bookstore on Fifth Avenue. The city around him never stopped moving. People walked by in a hurry, talking on their phones, sipping coffee, and going about their day. Cars honked, buses roared, and the world kept spinning. But no one ever stopped for Wally. He was just another homeless man, someone people avoided looking at for too long. His clothes were old, layered with dirt from years of wear. His long, tangled beard covered most of his face, and his hair was thick and unkempt. His eyes, hidden beneath heavy eyebrows, held stories no one ever asked to hear. His hands were rough and scarred, proof of a life that had not been kind. Some people whispered when they passed by. "He's been here forever," they would say. "I wonder what happened to him." Others simply ignored him, pretending he didn't exist. Once in a while, a kind stranger would leave a cup of coffee beside him or drop a few coins in front of him. Wally never begged for money, never held up a sign, never asked for help. He just sat there, watching the world move around him. There was something strange about Wally. He never spoke much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and deep, as if he had once been someone important. He wasn't like the other homeless people who gathered in the alleys or under bridges. He never fought for food, never got into trouble. He kept to himself, lost in his own world, as if he was waiting for something or someone. One winter, a group of teenagers passed by and made fun of him. "Hey, old man," one of them shouted. "Why don't you get a job?" They laughed and walked away, their voices fading into the noise of the city. Wally didn't react. He had heard worse before. He had learned a long time ago that the world wasn't kind to people like him. Despite everything, he never left his spot. Rain, snow, or scorching heat, he stayed right there. The bookstore owner, Mr. Henderson, had seen him every day for over a decade. "That man has a story," he would say to his customers. "I can feel it, but he never talks about it." 17 years passed this way. Every single day, Wally sat in the same place, a silent mystery in the middle of a fast-moving city. No one knew his past. No one cared to ask. But one day, something happened that no one could have expected. A black SUV pulled up in front of him, and in an instant, everything changed. For as long as anyone could remember, Wally had been part of the city, yet no one truly knew him. He was like a piece of old furniture in a familiar room, always there, but unnoticed. People assumed he had always been homeless, that he had never belonged anywhere else. But Wally had a past, a life that had been lost in time, buried under years of silence. Many years ago, he had been someone else. He had lived a different life, one with purpose, one where people knew his name. But something had happened, something so painful and irreversible that he had chosen to disappear. It wasn't an accident, nor was it something forced upon him. Wally had chosen this life of isolation, though no one would ever understand why. He had once walked with confidence, had once spoken with authority. But over time, he had let go of those parts of himself. The streets had taken away his sharpness, had softened the man he used to be. Now, when he looked in a broken mirror on the side of a building, he barely recognized his own reflection. The scars on his face, the tiredness in his eyes. He had become a ghost of his former self. But there were still moments, rare and fleeting, when his old self tried to break through. Sometimes, when he sat quietly in his usual spot, memories would come rushing back. He would close his eyes and see the places he had once been, the halls of a great building, the people who once listened to him, the decisions he had made. He would hear voices from his past, voices of those who had trusted him. But as quickly as the memories came, he would push them away. That life was over. It had been over for 17 years. What Wally didn't know was that not everyone had forgotten him. There were people who had been searching for him, people who knew exactly who he was. They had never stopped looking, never stopped wondering where he had gone. And now, after all these years, they had finally found him. In the last few months, strange things had started happening. A man in a black coat had passed by one too many times, always glancing at him before disappearing into the crowd. A woman had left a cup of coffee in front of him and whispered, "Stay safe, Walter," before walking away. The name Walter startled him. No one had called him that in years. How did she know? Something was changing. The world that had ignored him for so long was suddenly paying attention. He could feel it in the way certain people looked at him, in the way his instincts told him to be careful. But no matter what was coming, Wally was sure of one thing. His past was catching up to him. The days passed, but something felt different. Wally could sense it, though he couldn't explain why. For years, he had been invisible, just another homeless man sitting on the street, ignored by the busy world around him. But now, people were looking at him, not just strangers, but specific people. Men in dark suits, individuals who didn't belong in this part of the city, were watching him from a distance. They never spoke to him, never came close, but he knew they were there. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe he was getting paranoid. But then, the signs became clearer. A black car would pass by his corner more than once in a single day. A man with an earpiece stood near a coffee shop across the street, pretending to read a newspaper but glancing at Wally every few minutes. One evening, as Wally sat against the cold brick wall, he caught sight of someone taking a picture of him from a distance. When he turned his head, the person quickly disappeared into the crowd. Why now? Why after 17 years of being ignored? One night, as he tried to sleep under his old blanket, he thought back to his past. Could it be them? The people he had once known, the ones he had walked away from? No, it couldn't be. Too much time had passed. No one should even remember him. But deep inside, a small voice whispered, "They never stopped looking for you." The next morning, he decided to test his suspicion. He got up and walked away from his usual spot, something he rarely did. He turned down unfamiliar streets, taking unexpected turns, walking through busy areas to blend in. Yet, no matter where he went, he felt their presence. They weren't following him, obviously, but he knew they were there. They were watching, waiting. By the afternoon, Wally returned to his corner, exhausted. He sat down and sighed. He had lived in the shadows for so long, but now, the past was reaching for him. He didn't know whether to run or to face it. Then something even stranger happened. A well-dressed man walked past him, pretending not to notice him. But just as he passed, he dropped something, a small folded note. Wally hesitated before picking it up. His hands, rough from years on the streets, carefully unfolded the paper. It had only 2 words. "It's time." His heart pounded. He looked around, but the man was gone. Wally sat there, staring at the note, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity. For the first time in 17 years, his past was no longer a memory. It was real, and it was coming for him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement as Wally sat there, staring at the small note in his hands. The words, "It's time," were simple, yet they held a deep and unsettling meaning. For 17 years, no one had spoken his real name. No one had cared where he was. But now, someone had not only found him but was calling him back. His fingers trembled slightly as he folded the note and tucked it into his coat pocket. His heart was beating faster than usual. Who had sent it? What did they mean by "it's time"? Time for what? A storm of questions filled his mind, but there were no answers, only silence and the steady hum of the city around him. Minutes passed, then an hour. He tried to act normal, like nothing had changed, but deep down, he knew everything was about to be different. And then it happened. A black SUV with tinted windows slowed down in front of him. It was sleek, polished, and completely out of place on this side of the city. Wally tensed. He had seen expensive cars before, but they never stopped for people like him. The car door opened, and two men stepped out. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces calm but serious. They weren't just random strangers. These men had purpose. They had come for him. For a brief moment, Wally considered running. It was an instinct he had developed over the years. Avoid trouble, stay hidden. But something inside him told him that running wouldn't help. These men weren't here by accident. They had found him after 17 years. There was no escaping them now. One of the men, a tall figure with sharp features, took a step forward. His voice was steady, controlled. "It's time to come home, Walter." The way he said it sent chills down Wally's spine. He hadn't been called Walter in so long that it felt foreign, like a name that belonged to someone else. But there it was, his past, standing right in front of him. People on the street had started to notice. They slowed down, whispering to one another, watching the scene unfold. The homeless man they had ignored for years was suddenly the center of attention. Some pulled out their phones, trying to record what was happening. Wally swallowed hard. He looked at the men, then at the SUV, then back at the note in his pocket. This was real. Without a word, he pushed himself up from the ground. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to stand tall. The men stepped aside, giving him space to walk towards the car. As he reached the door, he took one last look at the city, the streets, the people, the life he had lived for so long. Then, without hesitation, he got in. The door shut behind him. The SUV pulled away, disappearing into the traffic. And just like that, Wally was gone. The black SUV moved smoothly through the city streets, leaving behind the world Wally had known for 17 years. He sat in the back seat, silent, his hands resting on his lap. The two men in suits sat in front of him, one driving, and the other checking something on a small tablet. No one spoke. The air inside the vehicle was calm, yet heavy with unspoken words. Wally glanced out the window, watching the city blur past. He had spent so many years on those streets, unseen and forgotten. And now, in just a few minutes, everything had changed. The people who had walked past him every day without a second thought would probably wonder where he had gone. Some might even feel guilty for never stopping to talk to him. But none of that mattered now. His past had finally caught up to him. After nearly half an hour of silent driving, the SUV turned onto a quiet road, far from the noise of the city. The buildings became fewer, replaced by trees and open spaces. Wally had no idea where they were taking him, but he didn't ask. He knew these men wouldn't have come for him unless it was important. Finally, the car pulled up to a large gated estate. The iron gates opened automatically, and they drove through, stopping in front of a modern, glass-covered building. The driver stepped out first, then opened the door for Wally. He hesitated for a moment, then got out, feeling the cool wind against his face. As soon as he stepped onto the pavement, the front doors of the building opened, and a man walked out. He was tall, well-dressed, with silver hair neatly combed back. There was something familiar about him, but Wally couldn't place it at first. Then, as the man got closer, Wally's heart skipped a beat. Richard Langley. The name rushed into his mind like a forgotten song. Wally had known this man years ago, back when he was someone else, back when he had a life. Langley had been one of the most powerful men in the government, a key figure in classified projects. If he was here, then whatever was happening was bigger than Wally had imagined. Langley stopped a few feet away, studying Wally carefully. His sharp eyes showed no surprise, as if he had known all along that this moment would come. After a long silence, he finally spoke. 17 years, Walter. We thought you were dead." Wally said nothing. What could he say? That he had chosen to disappear. That he had abandoned everything because of a mistake too painful to face. Langley sighed, his expression unreadable. "You were one of the greatest minds we had. And then you vanished. But now," he paused, "now, we need you back." Wally looked at the man he once worked with, the man who had trusted him with secrets few people in the world knew. And for the first time in years, Wally realized he could no longer run from who he was. Wally stood there, staring at Richard Langley, his mind racing. "We need you back." The words echoed in his head, pulling him back to a time he had tried so hard to forget. 17 years ago, he had been a different man, a man with purpose, power, and knowledge that only a few in the world possessed. He had been part of something big, something dangerous. It had been a secret project, one that had changed everything. And when things went wrong, Wally had done the only thing he could think of. He disappeared. Now, standing in front of Langley, he knew he couldn't escape anymore. Langley motioned toward the building. "Come inside, Walter. There's a lot to talk about." Without a word, Wally followed him through the glass doors. The interior of the building was sleek and modern, filled with high-tech screens and security cameras. The people inside, dressed in formal suits and lab coats, glanced at him as he walked past. Some looked surprised. Others whispered to one another. They knew who he was. Langley led him into a private office. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a large screen displayed a satellite image of some unknown location. Langley gestured for Wally to sit, then sat across from him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Langley leaned forward. "You disappeared without a trace, Walter. We searched for years. We thought you were dead." Wally took a deep breath. "Maybe I should have been." Langley shook his head. "You know that's not true. What happened back then? It wasn't your fault." Wally clenched his fists. "I made a mistake that cost lives." Langley's eyes softened. "And now you have a chance to fix it." Wally looked at the screen on the wall. The image zoomed in, revealing an isolated facility in the middle of nowhere. A place he recognized. His breath caught in his throat. "That's impossible." Langley's voice was calm but firm. "It's real. And it's happening again." Wally shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "I shut it down. I destroyed everything." Langley sighed. "You thought you did, but someone rebuilt it. And now it's worse than before." A cold feeling settled in Wally's chest. He had spent years convincing himself that his past was buried, that his mistakes would never come back. But here it was, right in front of him. The same danger, the same nightmare. Langley leaned forward. "We can't stop this without you." Wally looked down at his worn-out hands, the hands of a man who had lived in the shadows for nearly 2 decades. He had wanted to disappear forever. But now he had a choice to make. And deep down, he already knew what he had to do. Wally sat in silence, staring at the satellite image on the screen. His mind was a storm of emotions. He had spent 17 years trying to forget, trying to erase the past. But now it had found him again. Langley's voice broke the silence. "We don't have much time, Walter. If we don't act now, it'll be too late." Wally let out a slow breath. "Tell me everything." Langley nodded and pressed a button on the table. The screen changed, showing blueprints, security layouts, and live footage from hidden cameras. Wally's chest tightened. It was the same facility. The one he had helped build. The one he had tried to destroy. Langley continued. "After you left, we assumed the project was dead. We made sure of it. But someone picked up the pieces. They'd rebuilt it. Only this time, they took it even further." Wally studied the images. The security was tighter than before. The technology was more advanced. But one thing remained the same, the danger. "Who's behind it?" he asked. Langley's face darkened. "We're not sure. But whoever it is, they have resources, intelligence, and most importantly, they have your work." Wally's fists clenched. His work. The research he had abandoned all those years ago. He had walked away because he knew what it could do. And now someone had weaponized it. Langley leaned forward. "Walter, we need you to shut it down." Wally scoffed. You think I can just walk in there after 17 years? They probably have my face on every watch list. Langley smirked. That's the thing. To them, you've been dead for almost 2 decades. You're a ghost. And that makes you the perfect person to do this. Wally rubbed his temples. It was insane. He had spent so many years running, and now they wanted him to walk straight into the fire. But deep down, he knew the truth. If he didn't stop this, no one else could. Langley pushed a folder toward him. Inside are the details of the mission. You'll have full support, but once you go in, you're on your own. Wally hesitated. He thought about the life he had been living, the quiet, invisible existence on the streets. It had been lonely, but safe. If he said yes, that life would be over forever. But if he said no, how many lives would be lost? He looked at Langley, then at the folder. He reached forward, his fingers brushing against the cover. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled it toward him. Langley nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Welcome back, Walter." Wally didn't respond, because he knew this was only the beginning. The night was cold and quiet as Wally stood near the airstrip, watching the small jet waiting for him. The folder Langley had given him was in his hands, but he had already memorized every word, every detail. This was it. No turning back. A man in tactical gear approached him. "We have everything ready. You'll be dropped 5 miles from the facility. From there, you're on your own." Wally gave a small nod. Alone, just like he had been for the past 17 years. Only this time, it was different. This time, he had a purpose. As he climbed into the jet, memories flooded his mind. The first time he had walked into that facility, the day he realized what they were creating, the night he decided to destroy it. Back then, he had failed. But now, he had one last chance to set things right. The jet took off, soaring into the dark sky. He closed his eyes, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath him. He needed to stay sharp. This mission wasn't just about survival, it was about redemption. Hours passed before the pilot's voice crackled through the headset. "We're approaching the drop zone." Wally took a deep breath, stood up, and secured his gear. The back door of the plane opened, revealing the endless darkness below. "See you on the other side," the pilot said. Without hesitation, Wally stepped forward and jumped. The wind roared in his ears as he fell through the sky. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't care. He counted the seconds, then pulled the parachute. The sudden force jerked him upward as the fabric caught the wind, slowing his descent. Below him, the facility came into view, a massive structure hidden deep in the wilderness, surrounded by high fences and armed guards. It looked even more dangerous than before. Getting in wouldn't be easy. He landed softly in the trees, quickly detaching his parachute and moving into the shadows. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He had trained for this. Even after all these years, he still knew what to do. Step by step, he moved closer to the facility, avoiding security cameras and patrols. Every detail from Langley's briefing was proving accurate. They had no idea he was coming. As he reached the outer fence, he pulled out a small device, a tool he had designed himself, long before he had disappeared. With a few quick movements, the security system blinked off for exactly 10 seconds. That was all he needed. He climbed over and landed silently on the other side. He was in. For 17 years, he had hidden from this place, from his past, from himself. But tonight, Walter "Wally" Finch had returned. And this time, he wasn't leaving until the job was finished.